The Book of Revelation. It's one of the most powerful and, let's be honest, strangest books ever written. I mean, its visions of multi-headed beasts and cosmic battles have fascinated and, yeah, confused people for 2,000 years. So the big question is, where did its author, a prophet named John, get these wild ideas? In this explainer, we're going to go on a kind of academic detective hunt to uncover the raw materials he used to build his masterpiece.
All right, let's just dive right in with one of the most intense images in the entire book. John describes this final judgment where a giant wine press is used, but instead of wine, it spews a river of blood. A river so deep, it comes all the way up to a horse's bridle. It's an unforgettable, almost unbelievable picture of carnage. So you have to wonder, did he just make this up out of thin air, or was he pulling from something older?
To figure that out, we first have to look at Revelation's family tree, so to speak. See, John wasn't writing in a vacuum. He was part of this long tradition of Jewish apocalyptic literature. You know, works full of visions and angels and wild predictions about the end of the world. And right there, that's where we find our first huge clue. Okay, so when you put Revelation's text right next to a verse from a much older Jewish book called 1 Enoch, the similarity is, well, it's pretty striking. Both of them are describing a battle so bloody that horses are literally wading through it. For a long, long time, this direct comparison seemed like the obvious answer.
So the main theory was what we'd call direct literary dependence. It basically seemed like John of Patmos must have had a scroll of 1 Enoch right there with him and just borrowed the image. Maybe he made it a little more intense, raising the blood from the horse's chest to its bridle, but still a simple case of copying. It was a neat, clean explanation. But as scholars kept digging, that simple explanation started to unravel. The evidence began to point to something way more interesting going on. Not just a simple copy-paste job, but something about being part of a shared living tradition. The connection between these texts wasn't a straight line. It was more like a complex web. And this brings us to the core idea of our explainer today. To really get this, we have to introduce a key academic concept that pretty much unlocks this whole puzzle, the idea of the apocalyptic topos. A topos, that's T-O-P-O-S, is basically a traditional, recognizable literary theme. So an apocalyptic topos is a recurring image or story pattern, like, say, a massive flood of blood, that authors in this genre all knew about and felt totally free to use, to adapt, and to build on. Really, the best way to think about it is like a shared library or a common toolkit. These ancient authors didn't just have their scriptures. They had this mental library filled with these powerful, unwritten themes. So they weren't just copying one specific book. It's more like they were checking out a popular idea from the library and then giving it their own unique spin. So let's put this theory to the test. Let's go back to our river of blood. If John wasn't just ripping off 1 Enoch, then what exactly was he doing? As we're about to see, the proof is all in the details. Let's look really close at John's description again. He doesn't just mention the height of the blood up to the bridles of the horses. He adds a second, absolutely crucial detail. The distance it flowed, for 1,600 stadia. That's almost 185 miles. This second little detail is the key that unlocks the whole mystery. Okay, and this is where that simple copying theory just hits a brick wall. If you look at 1 Enoch, which came before Revelation, it mentions the blood's height, sure, but it does not mention a distance. Revelation, there in the middle, has both height and distance. But here is the really fascinating part. Look at the rabbinic and later Byzantine texts written after Revelation. They also have both height and distance, and they even add a third detail, that the blood flows into the sea. So here's the puzzle, right? How could Revelation share a key detail, that distance, with text written hundreds of years later when that detail is totally missing from the earlier text it was supposedly copying? It's impossible for Revelation to have copied from books that didn't exist yet, and it's super unlikely that all these later texts were just copying Revelation. This leads us to a really clear three-step conclusion. First, they weren't copying each other in a simple chain. That's out. Second, they were all independently dipping into a shared, well-known topos, some kind of tradition, maybe oral, maybe written, about a battle with blood of a specific height and a specific distance. And third, John was being a creative interpreter. He took this tradition and he adapted it, adding his own symbolic number, 1,600 stadia, which probably symbolized the total devastation of evil across the symbolic land of Israel. Now, this shared tradition model works great for big, violent images. But what about something quieter? Let's turn to our second case study, a moment of deep, puzzling silence right in the middle of all the heavenly chaos.
So in chapter 8, John describes the opening of the seventh and final seal. You'd expect this massive, thunderous climax, right? But instead, you get this: silence in heaven for about half an hour. This one verse has stumped people for centuries. Why would the constant worship in heaven just stop?
I mean, heaven in the book of Revelation is a place of non-stop praise. The angels and creatures never stop singing, "Holy, holy, holy." So this silence is a huge interruption. It's not just a dramatic pause. It has to mean something profound. And to find out what, we have to go back to that shared library of Jewish tradition. When you look into later rabbinic literature, a really consistent theme pops up. There's this idea that the angelic choirs in heaven go quiet at certain times, specifically so that the prayers of Israel on earth can rise up to God without any competition. It's like honor is being given to human worship. The angels have to wait their turn. This whole concept was even tied to interpretations of passages in the prophet Ezekiel. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but maybe that's a later idea that people read back into Revelation. But then we find this. This is the smoking gun. It's a text from before the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in 70 AD. The Testament of Adam directly connects heavenly silence with the exact moment the priests in the earthly temple offered incense. And in ancient Judaism, the smoke from that incense was the physical symbol of the people's prayers rising up to God. And boom, this brings it all back to what John is doing. The silence in verse 1 isn't random at all. It's creating a sacred space for what happens just 2 verses later, where an angel offers incense on the heavenly altar. Incense that we're told is the prayers of all the saints. John is tapping into a known tradition. Heaven goes quiet to give its full, undivided attention to the prayers of God's suffering people on earth. Okay, so we've seen what John was doing. He was using these shared traditions. But that brings up one last really important question. How? How were these ideas passed around and kept alive back then, especially when they weren't always written down in a book?
I mean, we're not talking about simple proverbs here. These are complex literary and theological ideas. They need a specific kind of social environment to be passed from one generation to the next and to move from Jewish circles into early Christian ones. What did that environment even look like?
Well, the most likely answer is that John belonged to this vibrant social network of early Christian prophets who were active in what was then the Roman province of Asia. This wasn't a solo gig. These prophets probably got together to study, to pray, and to interpret scripture and these very apocalyptic traditions. They learned from their Jewish heritage and then creatively reapplied these themes in light of their faith in Jesus. We even have hints about people like Philip the Evangelist and his 4 prophetic daughters moving to this exact region, and they could have been a bridge for these traditions.
All right, so let's wrap this up. What are the key takeaways here? First, John of Patmos was a seriously creative and sophisticated interpreter, not just someone who copied stuff. Second, he was swimming in this living, dynamic stream of apocalyptic tradition that flowed right from Judaism into early Christianity. Third, once you understand that he was using these shared themes, these topi, you unlock these incredible new layers of meaning in his work. And finally, books like Revelation weren't written in a vacuum. They were born out of active thinking and interpreting communities.
And this all leaves us with one last big, challenging question. You know, our modern world is kind of obsessed with originality and individual authorship. But if ancient prophets freely borrowed and adapted and reused ideas from a common wellspring, what does that tell us about how they understood creativity or tradition or even divine inspiration? It suggests a world where the greatest truths weren't always the newest ones, but were these timeless themes, passed down and polished by a whole community of faith.